Our next panelist, Paul Rhodes, is a visiting scholar at Stanford University and is the founder of Evolved Machines, a neural circuit applications research. Something happened here. Circuit applications research group in Palo Alto. Paul did his PhD under Rodolfo Linus at the NYU Medical School, received an MS in physics from Stanford University, after graduating in physics cum laude from Harvard. His academic research in the 1990s concerned simulation of cortical neurons and circuits, including the first model of bursting in cortical pyramidal cells, prediction of backpropagation in dendritic trees, and studies of the functional implications of synaptic integration in active dendritic trees. His company, Evolved Machines, is a research organization pioneering the synthesis of artificial neural networks, neural circuits, and their applications to olfaction and visual object recognition. The group is developing the first synthetic neural array which wire themselves by simulating neural circuit growth in 3 dimensions, and is the first company to harness the power of programmable GPUs for the simulation of neural computations, now achieving greater than 100-fold acceleration of the computing power of conventional cores. His company's goal is the development of the first generation of device fully based on brain circuitry, pioneering the fusion of neuroscience and engineering to develop new categories of machines which embed some of the capacities of biological neural systems. Paul?
Thank you, Jerry. You on? Good. Thank you, Jerry. I wanted to start by trying to touch on some themes that were brought up yesterday with 3 of the talks. There were talks by Dharmendra, Dr. Schutz, and Dr. Callaway on the fine structure of neural circuits. By fine structure, I mean their operation and their structure at the level of neurons, their dendritic trees. As you probably know, neurons are really electrically active trees. They're not simple nodes. The connections between them. Steve has just, through his talk, woven the thread that it's his belief that machine intelligence is going to emerge from the bottom up, by which I would mean we have to learn how to synthesize devices that do something sensory or sensory motor that are articulated at the level of neural circuits before we can gain an understanding of sensory motor coordination and then one day cognition. Not to start with cognition, but one day, perhaps past our career, certainly past this decade, to end with cognition. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a neural circuit articulated at that level doing a sensory processing problem, olfactory recognition. But I was so inspired by some of the ending parts of Steve's talk that I decided to start with the movie, in case I didn't have time to finish everything, because I'd like to give you a vision of how you can do what Hillis was advocating, which is to synthesize circuits that you may not understand that embed the information and the function throughout their fabric in the same way that real neural circuits do. And our group and one of our group members, a postdoc named Brian Tava, who's in the audience, is responsible for this work. Brian? He's taking a nap. He was up all night. Oh, there he is. There he is. I won't describe the background of how the system works except to say that it's a finite element model in 3 dimensions whereby dendrites and axons can grow. And during the panel, perhaps I can talk more about it. So this is one neuron growing in the synthesized 3-dimensional environment in a way that would resemble a turtle pyramidal cell. Now, groups have synthesized the growth of one neuron, but for some reason no groups that I'm aware of have synthesized the growth of a fabric of neurons, an array of neurons, where their branches interact with each other. These interactions in space, the crowding that's inherent in things growing in physical space, these are constraints that real neural circuits have to abide by in biological systems. These are also constraints that we will be dealing with if we ever physically grow neural circuits in the real world. Silicon neural circuits or some other substrate. So we have here a system where the neural circuit grows. Now, simply growing an array of neurons by itself doesn't embed any connectivity which could lead to input-output transformations in computation. So on the left, you see a wall of sensors. You could consider these the glomeruli of the olfactory bulb that code the identity of an odorant in a distributed high-dimensional code. These patterns that you'll see on the left-hand side, you could think of as a sequence of representations of different odorants, a banana and an apple and a pear, as they cascade. And what we're going to do is, in the simulation, is see those fibers grow in a very organic way into that field of dendrites and begin to form connections. So what you see here in this top view, you see these little white spheres. Those are the synapses, the connections between the axons and the dendrites. And they are forming in a self-organizing way as we play this sequence of odorants in the afferents, the banana and pear and apple representation, and we allow interactions between the axons that are active and the dendrites that happen to fire and the neurons that happen to fire. You can see, if you take a look at these cells that are connected to this one red axon, you can see cells coming in and out of the connectivity pattern as these connections form and disintegrate. The neuroscientists in the room will tell you that this formation and dissolution of connections is what happens during the growth of circuits. This is how circuits wire themselves, by the formation and dissolution of synapses. So I'm going to now jump from this demonstration to some practical work, which I had initially intended to start with. And I'm going to skip over, perhaps during the discussion after, I can talk more about my view of the fundamental computational elements of neurons and neural circuits. And let's just go straight to olfactory coding, which is, so we ground the work that we do at our research group with sensory problems. We don't simply study these systems in an academic and abstract way, although we do that, but we also believe that to understand them, we have to put them to work. And the simplest cortical paradigm, the cortical structure that is the one that's utilized by reptiles and fish, from which mammalian cortex evolved, is the olfactory cortex. And the simulation that I'm going to show you takes an array of neurons with this structure. They're simplified, of course, from real neurons, but yet they're more complex than neural network units. You can consider these incoming wires as those units on the wall that a pattern represents an odorant. They course through this array of neurons, like that green array of neurons that we grew. And these neurons have branches which fire if some threshold number of their inputs are coactive, which was what was going on in the simulation, but which you couldn't have resolved very easily. And then finally, the neurons themselves fire if some threshold number or more of their branches fire. So this neuron doesn't fire because it has a branch firing, but not enough. The mathematics of this can be analyzed. There's a transformation of the afferent representation from the sensors. There's a recoding into the firing of the array of branches, and then a further recoding into the firing of the array of neurons that is inherent in the function of this simple cortical system. Now, I'm going to put this to work with a real problem using real sensor data, not artificial patterns like in that movie. These are olfactory sensor vectors derived from the work of Ken Susslich at the University of Illinois. He's got one of the world's finest olfactory sensor arrays, and we've gotten his data and are collaborating with him. These are the representations of two distinct acids, octanoic and heptanoic acid. You can see by looking at their sensor representations that they are very similar. That's a cardinal problem that the cortex had to solve in the primitive state in which olfactory systems were really the dominant systems. A fresh apple and a rotten apple have almost identical molecular structure as in the odorants that characterize them. There's just a side group different. They therefore have very similar patterns of sensor activation. And yet an animal has to be able to distinguish them in order to function in the real world. This is a fundamental problem that the olfactory cortex solved. So here's the work that I'm going to show you uses sensory data derived from 89 distinct odorants, 3 samples of each. This is the whole panel of odorants. This is in the vertical would be, if I just took a little slice, that would be the odorants that, one of these is a stretched out slice vertically. And so that's our sensory data. The job here is to distinguish these odorants. If I present one of them, I want the machine I'm building to automatically, in the presence of noise, in the presence of background, automatically discriminate which odor is present. Now the problem is that these vectors are overlapping. This is the cross-correlation matrix of these 267 odorants. You can see families that are highly overlapping. These are the families of acids. I chose 2 of them. You see how overlapping odorant 2 and odorant 3 are if you take a look at this as a cross-correlation matrix. That's the fundamental problem. What I'd like is a readout from a neural representation that's red down the diagonal, which means that when I present odorant 20, my machine says that was odorant 20, and dark gray everywhere else so that I don't have interference, so I can build a system that's robust enough in the presence of noise and other interference that it can function in the real world. I won't explain all the guts of this because of lack of time, but here I have my input pattern. Here's an array of 1,000 neurons, each with 30 branches. I showed you a schematic of the neurons. Each of these squares represents a neuron. In red are the branches that fire. These neurons all have a threshold to fire, and in white are the neurons that fired upon presentation of this pattern. This, therefore, is the neural representation of banana, or in this case, it's octanoic acid. This is what I mean by the neural representation of the odorant. I could seek to prove to you, mathematically, as well as in simulation, that this transformation has utility. It orthogonalizes odorants in a way that facilitates their discrimination. So if you attempt, now real machines, and this is really a fundamental point, real biological machines, real creatures, you don't have to read out the olfactory representation as a separate standalone action, because all biological systems are sensory motor systems. The readout only is meaningful in the context of the motor action that the sensory representation triggers. Since I don't have legs on my artificial reptile here, I've constructed an artificial readout where each row in this vector identifies one of my 89 odorants. This is odorant 2, and right below it is odorant 3. And so what I want here is to, and I'll explain if time allows later how the readout is constructed. It's quite simple. But what I want here is to have this pattern of neural activity trigger odorant 2, and where now I have the next acid, odorant 3, which is very similar. If you compare these two, you see that there's some similarity, but there's also difference in the pattern of neural activation. And it accurately reads out the odorant identity. So if I were to now do this 89 times for all 89 odorants, this is what I get from this system. Here's the overlapping odorants in their raw form. Here's my readout after I've recoded it in the neural array. Let me just close, because my time is up and we have more time to talk after. Let me just close by saying that our company's thrust is, we've placed our bet very firmly on the foundation of synthesizing neural circuitry at the level of their fine structure, taking advantage of the connection specificity that Dr. Callaway showed us really is in the neocortex when you go and carefully measure from it. We're grounding it to in the service of the synthesis of real sensory devices. We think that's the way to one day get to cognitive computing. Not this decade. This decade we'll build machines that can recognize objects. But one day. Thanks very much.